My name is Robert Worth. I write about the Middle East for the New York Times Magazine. I'm sorry not to be with you in person. I'm appearing by video link from New Delhi in India, where I'm here for work. But it's a great honor to be here, even virtually. It's also an honor to introduce Philip Mansel, who I think is one of the best authorities on what the Levant means, what it has meant and what it means today. His books include Aleppo and Levant, which have been a tremendous resource for journalists like me and for many readers as well. Philip, good morning. Before Philip and I begin our conversation, I'll just say a few introductory words. In one sense, it's a profoundly discouraging time for the Levant, with sectarian divisions and wars and fragmented societies. But if you look under the surface, as anyone who has spent time in the region does, you find something very different. For me, some of the most satisfying times I spent when I was living in Lebanon were talking to people who welcomed me into their homes and who showed me photographs and various archives and whatever they had on hand, paintings, family memoirs and archives. A time that when the map of the region, physical and mental, was very different. And there were remnants of this all over the place: art, language, music, minglings of different traditions in cuisine, in architecture, in poetry. And this is really the true meaning of the Levantine identity, which has been muted, unfortunately, by so much conflict. In a sense, I think now is a very good time to be raising this question of what the Levant means, because the destruction of the region presents opportunities to start again. Many ideologies lie in ruins, and as the physical reconstruction begins in Syria and in Iraq, there will be urgent debates about identity. During the time I spent writing my book about the Arab uprisings and their legacy, I had many conversations with young people who were asking hard questions about who they were and what their relation to their neighbors ought to be. So with that, Philip, let me start off by asking you, who know this history better than anyone, I think. How would you define the Levant, geographically and in a broader cultural sense?
Yes, I think the Levant means the Eastern Mediterranean. It's a convenient shorthand for where the sun rises, le soleil se levant. And also the Levant is a concept, as Jamal and you were saying, of multi-identities. A certain attitude that is not trapped in one race or one religion or one state, who can shuffle identities like a pack of cards. And it flourished in many different periods. The Hellenistic period, for example, the Middle Ages, when there were Genoese and Venetians throughout the Mediterranean, and above all, perhaps, after the Ottoman conquest in 1516, when one state ruled the entire Middle East and North Africa, and it was easy to move from city to city.
Philip, can you tell us about some of the institutions, whether cultural, mercantile, or educational, that past and present, that helped to build a sense of transnational identity in the region, or pre-national, I should say?
The basic institution was the Ottoman Empire, the ease of movement with one passport. So that's why Aleppo felt so cut off from its markets and its history when the frontier came between Syria and Turkey, and Syria and Iraq, and Syria and Lebanon. Another institution which is much underrated is that of the consuls in these different cities like Izmir or Alexandria or Aleppo. French or British or Venetian consuls, they weren't just representatives of power, they were also facilitators of technological and cultural transfer. They were brokers. They were one-man institutions themselves, or in fact not one man, because they had staffs of interpreters and assistants. And they actually avoided conflict often. They defused conflict between Aleppo factions and the Ottoman Empire. They facilitated a peaceful transfer of power from Turkey to Greece in Salonika in 1912. They avoided conflict in Smyrna in 1770 and many other times, and in Beirut. So there's the Ottoman Empire, which, whatever its faults, it was a multinational empire and a multi-faith empire. There was an amazing exhibition on the treasures of the churches of Jerusalem at Versailles, the incredible gold and silver and vestments given by European kings. The Ottoman Empire allowed, the great Muslim state of the Ottoman Empire allowed Christian pilgrimage and encouraged it, in fact. And the third and perhaps greatest set of institutions were these fantastic foreign schools, not totally controlled by the state, set up by French and American missionaries, above all, in Istanbul, in Izmir, in Aleppo, in Beirut. They still flourish. The Université Saint-Joseph in Beirut, in the American University of Beirut. In Alexandria, the Collège Saint-Marc, with incredible buildings, is still there. And they gave their students of all faiths the equipment to deal with modernization and change. They were, of course, agents of cultural imperialism, but not only that. They also, they produced a lot of rebels, as the Victoria College in Alexandria did, and great Egyptian filmmakers. And really the unsung heroes of the Levant are those teachers, and also of women's schools, the Notre Dame de Sion and so on, which really helped make these cities something very unusual indeed.
Can you say a bit about the architecture? One of the wonderful things about going to a place like Beit Din is that syncretic blend of different traditions that we see all across the region.
And that again has Ottoman roots. The Ottoman sultans, they like to pick and mix their styles. It's even in Topkapi Palace, there are some Western elements in the 16th century. The incredible late Ottoman Baroque palaces like Dolmabahce are very eclectic and very exuberant. And a lot of Ottoman mosques were built by Armenian Christian architects. And then the specifically Levantine merchant houses are really magnificent 19th century civilian architecture. You see them in Mersin also. You see a few remnants in Izmir, where you have the house of Mustafa Kemal's father-in-law, which is really a French house. It's still there. That is, from its balcony, Mustafa Kemal watched the burning of Izmir. And unbelievable architecture in Alexandria. I urge all of you to go to Alexandria if you can and see what used to be called the Place des Consuls, because the consulates were all around it. It's now called, I think, Independence Square, with magnificent 19th century blocks by a Dalmatian Italian architect all around it, perfectly preserved. They're now taken over by shops, and they're really as finer than anything I've seen in Vienna or Paris. And Beirut had, until recently, some magnificent 19th century houses, of which the house of Lady Cochrane is, I think, one of the very last surviving examples, where you have a Italian Ottoman style with a few Ottoman inscriptions, but definitely Levantine and mixed styles.
Mm-hmm.
And these are living documents, these houses, and they're being preserved in Izmir as they're taken over by universities.
Philip, I remember years ago sitting with the Lebanese architect Asim Salam, whose house, in a sense, was a wonderful, in itself, blend of all these different styles and traditions. And he talked about his father and grandfather and their links with traders in what is now Israel. Can you talk a little bit about these trade routes that existed previously that used to bring together people from Aleppo, from Jaffa, and so on?
Yep. And Asim Salam and his family, they were fine examples of Levantinism because they were perfectly at ease in the West and very proud of the Muslim Lebanese roots. and very at ease with them, and he did his best to try and preserve old houses. The trade routes, well, and the architects, the traditional Ottoman civilian architects often came from the Balkans and moved round the Ottoman Empire as teams every year. That is why there are houses in northern Greece and in Macedonia which are very similar to houses in Aleppo and Damascus, and the same sort of frescoes and the same incredible wooden panels, 18th century panels. And the trade routes, there were a huge internal Ottoman market. Most of the trade of the souk of Aleppo was internal, and also trade routes going to Western Europe. It was often quicker to go from, say, Izmir to Marseille than Izmir to Diyarbakir, because maritime travel was easier, and trade routes from ports to ports run by French ships because they were better protected than Ottoman ships. And a huge takeoff of international trade in the second half of the 19th century with the opening of the Suez Canal, the growth of maritime trade, and these cities are really connected to global trade before the First World War. Izmir was trading with Boston and with India and with England.
You addressed this, Philip, but I wonder how much, I mean, it sounds, as you say, as if the Levantine identity was in large measure constructed by the Ottoman Empire. How many remnants are there of pre-Ottoman links across the region?
Well, there was a cutoff of contact between Arab countries and Turkey under Mustafa Kemal. Even at times he forbade the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca. But that is all now coming back as Istanbul becomes a global city again. It is just a natural, convenient meeting place, and above all, with people from the Balkans and from Russia and Central Asia. So that is coming back, and there's a completely new attitude to the Ottoman past, as historians are discovering that it wasn't all gloom and doom and actually quite positive. And of course, the presence of Syrian refugees in Turkey has a huge impact, not always positive, unfortunately, but it is reconnecting the two countries. So there are now Aleppo traders in Istanbul, as there were always before 1918. And it's also coming back with Balkan, and even now the Greek government is officially committed to protecting Ottoman monuments in Greece, where there are some magnificent monuments in northern Greece, particularly the foundation of Muhammad Ali, the founder of modern Egypt, who was from northern Greece or Thrace. And Egypt is re-evaluating this period too, but in the end, the issue is or was a language, as it was in the years before 1914 between the Young Turks and the Arab provinces. The Arabs didn't know Turkish and the Turks didn't know Arabic on the whole. Some of the elites did. So there was this language divide which Syrian refugees have found, but maybe that is disappearing, and now we have a new global language. It used to be French, now it's English. And Erdogan is committed to re-evaluating the links with the Arab world.
Let me ask you, how much of Levantine identity is tied up with the role of minorities in the region? After all, there were so many and so widely spread. Anatolian Greeks, Christians in Lebanon and Egypt, Druze scattered throughout Syria and Lebanon and so forth. How would you frame those?
Yes, well, minorities were very important. The great poet of the Levant is Cavafy, a Greek from Alexandria, who has this sense of vulnerability and threat, which is perhaps particularly Levantine. And because they had easier access to foreign schools, which were often Christian or Jewish run, therefore they tended to have more highly educated populations. Therefore they were more at ease with modern technologies and innovations. But I would say the original meaning of Levantine was anybody living in the Levant. And many, many Muslims of these cities like Salonika, Izmir, Alexandria, Beirut were also, in my opinion, completely open to the outside world and interested in other communities and faiths. You only have to read the memoirs of the period by Turks or Egyptians. The great novelist of modern Egypt, Naguib Mahfouz, he adored Alexandria. He said, this is a city where joy was walking in the streets. And many Egyptians went to Alexandria every summer before 1952. And the ruling family of Egypt, the house of Muhammad Ali Pasha from the port of Kavala in what is now Greece, they were Alexandrians, they were Levantines, they spoke English, French, Italian, as well as Arabic and Turkish. And I would say another example of a Muslim Levantine open to the outside world was Mustafa Kemal himself. He came from the great international port of Salonika. He read French. A lot of his reforms in Turkey were based on the practice and ideas of the French Third Republic, the books he read by Durkheim and others. And his wife, Latifa Hanum, from Izmir, she also spoke French and had lived and studied in Paris before 1922. So it wasn't just the minorities, it was also the people of all faiths in these cities.
Philip, in the mid-20th century, as you know, Arab nationalism exerted an overwhelming pressure and force. There have been, over time, efforts to claim a different kind of identity, not necessarily a minority one, whether religious or ethnic, but something altogether different. For instance, many Lebanese and even Syrians talk about themselves as Phoenician. Yes. At times, that's more a kind of rebellion than anything else. But have there been previous efforts to move beyond some of the divisions in the region by talking about a larger sense of identity?
Well, not many and not enough, in my opinion. And of course, Mustafa Kemal at times tried to say the Turks were the descendants of the Hittites. No, the state has this grip on national education, of course, and on hearts and minds until recently. So Greek nationalism, Turkish nationalism, Arab nationalism, Egyptian nationalism always had elements of xenophobia, of fear and resentment, not always totally unjustified, of foreign schools, foreign influences, as well as foreign governments. Though to have the national states, they also relied on foreign help and foreign influence, even Jamal Abdel Nasser, and of course the early Greeks in the War of Independence. Even Mustafa Kemal had French weapons in his struggle for liberation. And I think now we're living in another global age, like the age before 1914. And obviously no one can believe that the national state can provide all the answers or all the cultural influences. So let's hope we're entering a new era of new Levants and new understanding of our own very mixed and varied identities.
Yes. I wanted to mention also that I was very struck in the years just after after 2011, to hear young Syrian friends of mine asking questions that really wouldn't have been asked before about what it means to be an Arab and rejecting certain aspects of that political identity, and even asking whether they were Arabs, whether they wanted to be Arabs. It struck me as a fruitful discussion just because these were topics that, as I said, had been sort of forbidden before. I'm not sure where they lead. We're in a kind of still a state of war in that region. It's hard to say how young people can forge a new one. But are you hopeful about the possibility that out of this chaos may rise something good, something new?
Well, they're voting with their feet. They're trying to migrate, to leave. So that isn't very hopeful. And in all these countries, the desire to leave their own states is itself the most eloquent testimony to what they really feel about the nation state. And the same feeling of rejection is happening in other countries, like in Egypt, rejection of Arab nationalism and saying, we're Egyptians. Before 1939, there were people like Taha Hussein who said, we're Mediterranean first, and they built in neo-Pharaonic architecture, not in neo-Islamic. And Turks are now finding maybe they had an Armenian grandmother or Greek great-aunt. It's hard to be optimistic in the Middle East or Europe or indeed the United Kingdom. But maybe we have some hope with the resilience of cities like Beirut, which I think has 37 universities or some extraordinary statistic like that. Other international cities are appearing like Hong Kong and Dubai. London and Paris are international cities. Let's hope that people will find through universities and jobs and marriage patterns and cities the internationalism, the Levantinism, which isn't always protected by states.
One additional note about that cities, after all, did provide a measure of, in reading your book about Aleppo, it struck me that many of the people in Aleppo would have, at least at certain times in history, would have defined themselves more as Aleppans than as anything else. Is that right? And can you say a little bit more about local identity in some of these?
I've heard people from Aleppo say that to me now, this year, and maybe that's coming back. And I've also heard Turks from Izmir saying I'm Izmirli or Aegean first and Turkish second. I've heard Egyptians say that from Alexandria also. Intense urban and local pride. But that doesn't always give you a passport or a job. Let's see what happens. And it's coming back in Salonika also, though they have rediscovered the Levantine and international past, where Greeks and Turks were a minority in that city. It was majority Jewish. I feel a Londoner before I'm an Englishman. I'm fed up with English nationalism and what it's doing now to the United Kingdom. But again, cities don't have armies, cities don't have passports. We need to give something concrete to people, to give a concrete form to urban identity.
I feel a bit that I'm in some ways a New Yorker rather than an American, or perhaps before an American as well. Yeah. It is a, go ahead.
You see the same pattern in voting patterns in the United States, the coasts against the hinterland in the middle. And who was it who said New York is an island floating off the coast of Europe?
It's remarkable to me that one of the striking experiments right now in the Middle East is this area of northern Syria, Rojava, where you have Kurds, who, or let's say a Kurdish political party that is fostering an identity based in large part, it seems, on the work of a Vermont-based socialist, Murray Bookchin, who was a believer in women's rights and in environmentalism. And instead of seeming a kind of academic exercise, these Kurds seem as passionate as any newly converted Islamist in terms of their ideology. It's, as you say, the question is, what about the power of the state? They're a statelet now. They don't have any kind of recognition, and perhaps may never. But it's kind of an interesting measure of the frustration people have with current state boundaries that experiment continues.
And in fact, the evolution of Kurdish areas in Iraq and Syria, it shows you can move ahead without a legally recognized state. But as you say, how long that will last, I don't know. But certainly Kurdish Iraq is more stable than non-Kurdish Iraq at the moment.
And in Syria, my understanding, I haven't been to the area of Sweda, but it's a primarily Druze area where they have managed to negotiate a relative calm, that fewer people there have been killed, there's been less destruction, that because they exert quite a bit of control and because the Druze elders were able to restrain younger men, it's been relatively peaceful.
Yeah, well, let's hope it lasts.
Okay, well, thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Robert.
It's always a pleasure talking.
Thank you, Robert. See you next time. Thank you.